So thank you very much for joining me today, Peter. We're going to talk about talent trends for 2023. So to start, we've obviously got recession either already in place or looming in many countries around the world. And we've seen layoffs in many sectors. What do you think the biggest talent trends are going to be more generally for this year, given that backdrop?
I think unlike previous recessions, this one feels very different. I think this is the first recession in my working lifetime where there is still a deficit of talent. So there are many sectors, not least of which the some of the service economy, so retail and hospitality, where there is a huge shortage of talent, and adult social care, NHS, which we hear about regularly in the UK. When you look at the broader global economy, there have been some huge moves made by the tech giants, so that the Metas, the Googles, the Microsofts, either stopping hiring or laying people off. But actually, when you talk to the next layer of tech organizations down, they are still hiring. So they are still struggling to find good talent. So tech talent, it is much more available than it was 6 months ago. But there are still a lot of areas within that tech arena where talent is still very short. There are other emerging areas. So ESG is a huge focus, particularly for some of the big consultancies. I read something not so very long ago that I think PwC was aiming to hire 10,000 people into their ESG practice. And there aren't probably that many people available in ESG at the moment, or with the right skills. So there's certainly a huge opportunity there, as well as areas like biotech, which are traditionally difficult to find talent. So I think it's going to be different. There's no doubt that the recession is upon us, certainly in the UK. US seems to be flirting with it. I think depending on which data you look at, they've been in, not been in, been out. The general consensus I'm hearing from clients and some of the non-executives that I talk to is people are expecting a challenging H1 for talent in 2023 as organisations rebase, review, in some cases cut. I read this morning Goldman Sachs are losing 6% of their global workforce, which might be up to 3,200 people. So businesses are rebasing, but I think most commentators that I speak to expect a strong recovery through the end of Q2 and going into H2 of this calendar year.
In terms of from the employee, the candidate perspective, do you think there's anything that came in the last couple of years in terms of trends that are going to change this year? For example, what are you hearing about candidates still wanting flexible working, for example, or better well-being? What sort of are you getting feedback from your country leads and yourself on that?
Yeah, I think there is still a huge demand for flexible and hybrid working. So, I think that that genie is out of the bottle, to coin a phrase. There is definitely a much stronger push from organisations to get people back in the office more consistently. You will probably read the same articles as me saying, Tuesday to Thursday is the new working week. And, I think the organisations are beginning to feel, particularly the organisations that are making cuts, they are beginning to feel that they have the power again. So it is absolutely the case that some of those organisations are taking the opportunity to unwind some of the flexible working options that they had offered. I don't think that will ever unwind completely. Some organisations will probably try to do that, but there are still, certainly within the last couple of months, I've still spoken to organisations who are struggling to hire because they do not offer flexible working in any shape or form. So I think that's here to stay, but I certainly think it will be rolled back. I think those workers that were, fully remote, off working in Slovakia, but their employment was based out of London, I think they are starting to feel some pressure. Certainly Twitter fairly famously sort of said you're back in the office 5 days a week, which I think a lot of people thought was redundancy by stealth. But equally, if you're one of those people who's taking the opportunity to move out of the valley and you're sat in Wyoming and you suddenly need to be back in the office, then you're very stuck. There's not much you can do about that. So it'll roll back. I think, 3 to 4 days in the office will probably become the norm for people who used to be full-time office-based. And there are lots of positives that you are now starting to hear being talked about time in the office. The water cooler conversations, the ability to network, particularly for the earlier in career generations. That was always talked about a little, but that's being talked about a lot more as being valuable and a reason to ask people to come back into the office more.
Is this, therefore, do you think, the beginning of a trend to the power shifting back from the employee that we've been talking about for the last few years to the employer? And is that just a result of this recessionary and challenging economic environment? Do you think it's a blip in a way? Do you think the power has moved?
Absolutely. I think that's absolutely what's happened. And, and again, as it ebbs and flows when, talent gets tighter, clients might end up having to be more flexible again. But I think the parameters in which it will ebb and flow as the economic cycles vary have changed and changed permanently. So I think we'll be talking about 3 to 4 days as the normal working week. Whether it's quite Tuesday to Thursday, I don't know. But I think 3 to 4 days will become the normal working week in the office for people who are in traditionally desk-based office jobs. And then beyond that, it will be, it will be as the economy and as market shortage dictates. I mean, I was reading something this morning about HMRC and their work from home policy, and some of the challenges people have had. I think it was 99,000 people can get through to HMRC last week because they're working from home and the phones aren't being answered. So one would suggest that will probably end up with a shift in the working from home policy from HMRC, because it will have to from a customer point of view. But I can't see them going all the way back to being in the office full time. You
talked at the beginning about there being a deficit still in some sectors. And I know that Gartner's research says that the majority of HR leaders still think the labour market's going to be competitive this year. And they talk about, if you come across that, but it's, without acquiring new full-time employees, it's like upskilling and stretch assignments and moving people into priority areas. Do you agree that's likely way that people are going to approach this competitive talent market in 2023?
I think that's been happening already. I think, again, but probably more in some sectors than others. So I think if you go to the tech sector, particularly those bigger tech clients that have big teams, big budgets, they have been taking people on right through the pandemic and beyond, certainly right through 2022, who have the right attitudes and competencies without necessarily having the right skills. So we've seen a number of cases where they've taken people on with the explicit intent of training them up into a role that they're not currently capable of doing. I think it will become more so. Again, without wanting to be political, I think, it is a shame that the apprenticeship levy has been very challenging. And many organisations have viewed it as a tax rather than as an opportunity to train. And I think that comes back to the, in some disciplines, in some sectors, the lack of availability of appropriate apprenticeship courses. So I think there's an opportunity there for more training through apprenticeships, as well as just internal development and internal mobility and upskilling. So yes, I think organisations are doing it, but it will become more so. And we have seen quite an interesting trend in leadership and succession. So within leadership risk and the leadership development space, we've seen more organisations taking people from moving people between disciplines as a way of keeping them and giving them internal development. And particularly in the US, that's been a really big trend. Difficult to do, takes a lot of effort, a lot of internal energy. But when you think about the failure rates of people coming in from the outside at executive level, it's certainly in some organisations with particular cultures, organisations are rightly, I think, taking the view that sort of internal mobility is a good solution.
What do they need to do to try and sort of overcome those risks? What should they look at?
I think it's about finding those opportunities where there are some obvious correlations between the types of activity that will be done. So for one of the examples that we heard of in the US was somebody going from a CFO role into an operational MD role. Now, that's not all that uncommon. But what we've also heard is someone from HR going into a front office call center ops role, which is slightly less usual. So there's some link. It's not, you're not taking a finance person into marketing necessarily, although again, probably no reason why not, or a marketing person into finance, maybe the more difficult of those two moves. I think that the organisations that have done it and done it well have found those people in the executive team who are prepared to try. So they found people that are happy to make almost take the pilot, take the test case. And there's an awful lot of communication, negotiation. There's an awful lot of training and coaching that goes on. So it's very time heavy to make sure it works, both with the team that the individual's going into, because obviously there's some technical knowledge that the leader will not have in many cases, but also in terms of the individual and making sure that they aren't feeling isolated or out of their depth. So it is hard, but it is certainly possible at leadership levels, and where you're looking at skills which are more easily trained, so below the management layer, it can be done and is being done quite regularly.
You said there that it's obviously very time consuming to do this, and that people are doing almost pilots on it. Is it something you see that could be replicated in some way? Is there like a system or a process that can be developed, or a type of technology or help from people like you, use of data? What can be used to help people facilitate this?
I mean, we are more talent consulting than anything else, but certainly there are some terrific leadership development and leadership coaching people that we work with, that we certainly we can recommend and connect people with. I think it has to be so sensitive to the organisational culture. I think a sort of straightforward playbook would be, there might be a sort of a straw man you could put together that would be a methodology for doing this stuff. But I think it's so culturally sensitive that it tends to be developed by a TA or a CHRO who really thinks it's the right thing to do. Of course, many multinational organisations have sort of done this for years. A Japanese bank, for example, is one that I know of who had historically had a rotation program of bringing the executive leadership into the US from people on the executive team in Japan. And they're now starting to unroll that, where actually they're not having sort of home office, corporate office executives running regions. They're actually bringing the regional leaders through and giving them opportunities more locally. So it's kind of a variation of that, but done within a single country rather than across borders.
And do you think, in terms of expanding that talent pipeline, candidate pipeline, we're going to see a strengthening of the sort of pursuit of more non-traditional candidates? So perhaps relaxing the sort of entry barriers from degree level, for example, or looking more to groups of people that you wouldn't traditionally perhaps have brought in, neurodiverse or ethnic minorities, whatever. What are you seeing yourself and then around the world in terms of that?
I mean, one thing that has been really encouraging over the last several years is, the amount of effort that's gone into, helping various underrepresented groups into the workplace. Now, there's a hell of a lot more to do, but again, neurodiversity is being talked about more regularly. There's blogs, there are people who are regularly talking about that, and that helps. Social mobility is being talked about more and more, particularly in the banking sector, where I think it is perceived to be a particular problem, and the legal sector. And I know that some of the big four accountancy firms publish their social mobility data. So again, they are very clear that that's a big area they need to work on. So I think, people from non-traditional backgrounds are becoming a greater part of the conversation. I think there's still an awful lot to do. People coming from different skills and trying to transfer their skills is happening more, absolutely, definitely. So, again, I think it's PwC and EY, and maybe more than that have dropped their 2-1 requirement for their initial graduate program, and also have significantly expanded their apprenticeship programs as well. And I think I read last week, I'm pretty sure it's Santander, had also been the first of the pure play banks to drop their 2-1 requirement for their graduate program as well. So, there is certainly a greater emphasis on attributes beyond academic performance. How well that translates into bringing people who are neurodiverse and from lower socioeconomic backgrounds is I don't think there's a lot of data on the results, but it's certainly something that I know TA and HR communities are working hard on, and it will be done more and more, I think, particularly in those areas where skills are still hard to find.
We've got the real contradiction here between tightening economic circumstances and high profile layoffs. And then, as you said, also this tightening labour market and talent market.
Yeah.
So it's a very strange position to be in, I think. How can leaders ensure that they don't just take the knee-jerk reaction? I had a discussion with one of your colleagues about short-term and longer-term approaches here. How can they make sure that they're fit for purpose for this difficult, weird year ahead, but also not taking their eye off that longer term strategy, maybe that sort of 3-5 year approach that they want, given the trends in talent?
I would expect a slight economic softening, and again, whether it's recession or not, time will tell. I think in the UK it will be. In the US, I think it's still slightly debatable. Again, I think many parts of Europe and are in recession, I think, already, and I certainly think that the Asia Pacific region is seemingly faring a little better, but may well still go into recession. I think what we will see is there'll be a slide, I think a bit of a slide towards having to do things differently and bring in different skills. I guess the interesting case studies on this are probably outside of the technology arena. If you go to the big tech firms, they are really good at bringing people in at entry level, training, developing, bringing them up through the ranks. They need to do more, but they're pretty slick and we're pretty good at doing that. When you look at a sector like engineering or anything which is a STEM-based career, you find that they've been tackling these problems for a very long time, and it isn't something that can be solved because what you find, particularly when you're looking for underrepresented talent, so female engineers is a really good example of that. There are only so many, so a lot of the work we do is helping organisations identify where that female talent exists in engineering, as an example, and rather than just helping them go higher, what we try and do is help them understand the behaviours, motivations, aspirations of that cohort of people to allow them to put something in play that is genuinely a long-term commitment if somebody were to move. Because otherwise all you do is you end up, people move and move and move, and the salaries just go up and up and up, and you get into that spiral and you never actually get any more talent in. So we need to help organisations find roles for underrepresented talent, as an example, that have a long-term future to them rather than just a knee-jerk to we need to hire now. Beside that, we also need to help our clients think about the future. So, when your average engineer, as is the case for one of my clients, and I'm sure it won't be the most extreme, the average age of their engineering population is 56 years old. So they've got a cliff edge coming in the next 10 years at some point. And they are doing a huge amount of work through apprenticeship programs, through their own training academies, through purpose-built training centres to train that future cohort of engineers. But that is a 10-year, not a 5-year play. But we're always advising clients to make sure that they are looking not just at dealing with the problem now, but also looking at the problem in the future, because otherwise all we do is we create increased demand, everyone poaches from everyone else, and all that happens is salaries go up without more people in the market. So the efficiency of the whole economy in that sense declines.
How does that approach feed into the leaders? So ensuring that we have the right leaders in place ready for the future, and what roles do you think are most critical there?
I mean, there are the roles that are most critical in certain spaces will often be the technical roles. And now again, there is that perpetual debate between individual contributors versus leaders, and making sure there are comparable development scales for people who are technical experts but don't have the right capabilities to be leaders. If we think about what's changed through the pandemic, one of the major shifts in leadership has really been around sort of the behaviours that are deemed acceptable for leaders. So the autocrat, seems to have had their day, which you can argue that there's good and bad to that. But I think on the whole, people would think a more open, inclusive leadership culture, leadership style is a good thing. So I think that is a different group of people than people that are currently in leadership roles. So I think over the course of the next, let's say, 5 years, as investors and as shareholders and as non-executive boards push for different behaviours in the boardroom, I think that will naturally bring a different cohort of talent into those roles.
So to sum up, what 3 pieces of advice can you share with businesses and HR leaders for this year in terms of rethinking their talent approach? So what 3 things should they concentrate most on, do you think, in 2023, given these challenging circumstances?
The advice to the TA and HR leaders is always an interesting one to give, because often there's somebody else that holds their budget. I think the advice I would give, because we've seen clients get it wrong so many times through so many recessions, is don't just stop. Quite often you will see, a hiring freeze, or we can't do anything now, or there's no budget. And of course, organisations have to be careful with their money. But I think what we'd say to clients is you might stop giving offers, you might have to stop giving offers, but you shouldn't stop pipelining, engaging with, socialising talent, because those that certainly in the pandemic, those that kept hiring and certainly kept talking had a massive advantage when it came to the other side of the pandemic, when lockdown eased and when the world started to get back to normal, because they were able to react much more quickly. So I think don't stop is the first piece of advice. I think there is certainly a case for prioritising which talent you need where, and I think a part of that has got to be around what are the skills that you might need for certain roles for the future. So that planning for the future. So again, it's leaning into strategic workforce planning. It's always amazing how small the SWP community really is of sort of pure play specialists. So there are only a handful of people that are spending their whole lives looking forward at what the workforce of the future will look like. And I think that's going to become more and more important as we become more technologically advanced. So I think future planning is a huge part. And I think, understanding what leadership your business needs for the future and planning for that. Because I think some organisations have made some brave decisions, but a lot have not. What was I reading this morning? The average age of a male board member in the UK was 61, and the average age of a female board member in the UK is 58. And I think it's 60 and 57 in Europe. So, leadership and succession is still not being done well or early by a lot of organisations, and the world's changed. So, I think that average age should be a concern to investors.
That's a really good point to end on, but it's not my very last question, because my very last question is just, as I've got you here, how can Armstrong Craven help people attacking those challenges and dealing with issues like succession?
A lot of the work we do, certainly more than 50% of the work we do, is helping clients think about future talent. So it's not the job here now. It is, who are the people that we want in the future? What are the skills that we see coming through? What are the behaviours of an organisation? What is it that's important to people coming into a new environment? So because a lot of what we do is research, well, everything we do is research driven, but a lot of what we do is looking deeper. So it's kind of that inch wide, mile deep behaviours, motivations, small talent cohorts, where people are thinking about the future of a leadership community. They need to understand what's available. And so, we will help clients understand what the art of the possible is within their leadership community, either from just who else is available, or how do we improve the representation within our board. So we help them understand what the landscape looks like before they get into having to hire, and that's how it should always be done. Of course, you shouldn't always be reacting. It shouldn't be a reactive situation when you're replacing a board member. But surprisingly, few organisations have the bandwidth or the budget or our understanding that that's important, and the more they do, it will help them be successful in the future.
Absolutely, that will really mark out those who succeed versus those who don't move forward, I guess. So thank you for that. I think it's up to all of us to look for the art of the possible when it comes to talent. So I really appreciate your time today, Peter, and your good insights. So thank you. And I hope that it's a positive year for everyone.
Let's hope so. Well, I think there's still plenty of opportunity around. I say it's a recession like no other. Nobody has a crystal ball, but I think it will be very different, I think.